Big change, guys. Macroevolution. Yeah. So we're gonna talk about, ladies. We're gonna talk about. So we've talked about microevolution. So I'll give you another neat example of microevolution. If you look around the world, there was a study done where they were looking at. You guys know what salivary amylase is? No? It's an enzyme that helps break down starch. Yeah. So if you look at how many, so this has nothing to do with allele frequencies, okay? So it's not really a Hardy-Weinberg scenario, but it is an example of microevolution. They were looking at how many copies do you have of a gene that makes salivary amylase. And the salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down starch into sugar, okay? The idea is, if you have more copies of it, you break down the starch more quickly. It helps you digest the starch, and it's an advantage if your diet is rich in starch. But if your diet is not rich in starch, having more copies of this enzyme doesn't really give you an advantage. So what they did is they did a little study. Well, actually, it was a big study. Where they said, let's look around the world and let's look at people, ethnic groups that have a really starch-rich diet versus groups that don't. And what they found is there's a correlation. They found that groups that have a really starch-rich diet had, on average, about 7 copies of this gene, whereas other groups may have had as low as 5 copies, the ones that didn't eat as much starch. That's a small change. I mean, you would not can really tell by looking at someone that they had an extra copy or 2 of the amylase gene. So microevolution means little change. Macroevolution are the things that are big and you can generally see them. And that's what we're going to talk about. Or we're going to introduce that idea today. Okay? So, the biggest type of change that you could generate is when you actually produce a new species. So, and ladies, you're the first semester that I've been recording my lessons for, but I can easily stop recording if I find out people aren't paying attention. So, alright. So pay attention. Okay, just a little warning shot across the bow. Okay, alright. So, the biggest type of change you can generate is to produce a new type of species, and that's called speciation. Yes, bread maker?
So when you have a hybrid of 2 organisms?
We're going to talk about that. Hold on. Can you just hold on to that a second? Okay. So, how do you know you have, first of all, we're going to know what is a species. So what's your definition of a species? Sabrina?
Basically organisms that can interbreed with each other.
Right. In other words, they can have babies with their own. But I know Erica just raised the question about, and I know you're going with this question. What about things that are not the same species that can have babies, right? I'm assuming that's where you were going. The definition of a species is things that can get together with other members of their own that can have babies, but those babies can have babies. So the babies are not sterile, they're fertile. So you can probably think of an example of 2 things that can have babies, like a horse and a donkey a horse and a donkey make a mule, but the mule is sterile. So the horse and the donkey are separate species. They're different enough that their offspring can't have their own babies, okay? So if 2 things can't get together and have babies that can reproduce, then we can classify them as separate species. However, this definition is simple, but it has flaws because not everything, as you know, gets together to reproduce, right? You're doing a whole lab on this. A lot of things reproduce asexually. They don't need to get together with other things, so you could not define them this way. But we're going to keep our world simple, and we're going to just look at things that reproduce sexually. Yeah?
Can it happen dogs?
No, they're dramatically different. In fact, I was stunned to read this. I'm reading this book on human evolution. There were experiments done and I believe it was in the 20s and 30s, where they were trying to see if you can get humans and other primates together to make babies. And they actually had, I can look it up for you. I have the book at home. If you remind me, I'll bring it in. Russia actually went forward and was trying the Soviet Union at the time, were trying these experiments. And I know they had volunteers. They had tried to do the experiment in another country, and then eventually the government said, no, we can't do this. This is kind of unethical. But I know Russia was entertaining the idea, and they had enlisted some volunteer women, and they were going to impregnate them with, I believe it was chimpanzee or gorilla semen, to see if they could produce babies. Obviously, it doesn't work, because we're not the same species. Yeah.
Did you hear about the woman who was like, she was going to give birth to a Neanderthal? A what? Or something like that. I don't know.
A Neanderthal?
I don't know. I read it somewhere, but I don't know.
Okay. Well, that's interesting that you raised that, because there was a theory at some point that Neanderthals and humans never bred. They never got together and had babies, and it turns out not to be true. It turns out that we have about in our genome about 3 to 4% of our DNA actually comes from Neanderthals, and the only way you can get DNA from another source is if you had babies with them, right? Yeah. So they were close enough to us that we can classify us as the same species as them, maybe a subspecies. If you're different enough, though, that shouldn't happen. Okay? So here you're seeing a representation of speciation. Okay? Here's your original population, and then what happens is it branches off to form 2 new species, and eventually we can define them as new species because they don't get together. Either they don't want to get together, or they can't get together. Okay? If they don't produce babies, then we're going to classify them as separate species. Now, you know how evolution works, right? It's very simple. You need variety, right? And something like mutations and sexual reproduction gives you variety. Then you need something to select, weed out what's good, what's bad. Okay? So the sickle cell allele, that was generated by a mutation that generates variety. Is that good or bad? Depends. If you're living in a malarial zone, having 1 copy of that gene is actually good. So natural selection or sexual selection works in the variety, and then over time, what do you get? You get change, right? That's evolution. Variation, selection, and time. But if you want to make speciation, if you want to make big change, if you want to make things different from each other, you need 1 more ingredient. And that ingredient is depicted in this picture. You need, and I'll give you see if you can figure it out. You need isolation. You need some form of barrier that will take your groups, split them up, so that they evolve in separate directions. They accumulate enough differences that they don't want to get together. Now, the type of isolation could be either physical. So in this picture here, you can see a physical barrier. In this picture here, these 2 squirrels are opposite sides of the Grand Canyon, so they can't get together. So they're undergoing their own evolution. You would expect that over time, they would just accumulate more and more and more differences. And eventually we could say that they're going to become 2 separate species. Yeah?
Did a squirrel and a chipmunk?
No, I don't think so.
Then how do squirrels become like chipmunks?
Well, you know that things can evolve to look like each other, but not be. Either they look like each other because they have common ancestors that look like that, but they could evolve to look like each other. Like whales and sharks look very similar.
There's a squirrel that lives in the brush.
And he has something for a chipmunk, right?
It's like chipmunk.
Yeah.
You know, like he's like random things. So what you're saying is it's a squirrel.
Well, I haven't said the other one yet. So it's either going to be a physical barrier. So if it's something physical separating the 2 organisms, we call this allopatric speciation. So this is when you have a physical barrier that prevents a group from mating with another group, and they evolve to become really different. In this one, sympatric speciation, it's the same idea. You need some form of isolation, but it doesn't have to be physical. It could be behavioral. For example, if you imagine a type of plant in a forest where they can release pollen, and another type of plant, you know how plants reproduce, right? You know, the pollen is the male sperm, and it has to be transferred to basically the female part of the plant. Now, if the plants are separated really far apart from each other, like in this picture here, you're seeing there's a physical separation. Maybe that's allopatric, okay? But another form of isolation, which is sympatric, could be something like the timing of development. Maybe as you know, not all plants release pollen at the same time of year. So if plant A wants to reproduce in April and releases pollen in April, but plant B doesn't want to reproduce until September, they may live in the same forest, so they're not physically separated, but they are behaviorally separated, because A and B will never get together because they don't reproduce at the same time of year. Yeah. Say again? Yeah, but that would be natural, right? Here we're talking about the natural world, right? We can always fool around with certain things, yes. But that's just an example of, you know, a type of isolation that's not physical in nature. Yeah. I wouldn't know. I have some possible guesses. I mean, you don't want to do it at any time in the year, because if you might be competing with a lot of other other plants, and maybe sometimes it's a good idea to only reproduce at certain times of the year, so there's not as much competition. I would probably guess that's one of the reasons, right? Okay, so here's the big idea. The big idea is you need variety selection, you need time, but you need one more thing, which is this concept of isolation if you want to make things more different. So, what's really interesting, if you look at humans, the opposite's happening. You know, if you go back 5, 6, 7, 800 years ago, we were pretty isolated. When you wanted to get together with someone and have babies, who are you getting together with? Whoever's living next door, basically, right? There was no, I'm going to get on a plane and go to Sweden and find my soulmate. That did not happen. I mean, you did get some of that, but for the most part, people were isolated. What's going on now? I mean, look around the room. Like, think about where everyone in this room is from. You can probably map out the whole world here, right? It's different now. In fact, taking the isolation away might mean we're actually becoming more like each other, as opposed to becoming more different from each other. So it's very interesting what's happening with humans. Very interesting. So here's an example of a type of isolation that is. Oh, did I tell you what that's called, by the way?
No.
So isolation that's not physical in nature is called sympatric speciation. Non-physical. That's not physical. It's not a physical barrier. So, yes, yep. These are all natural things, right? So, give me an example here. So here we have a plant. So here this plant, and this is actually pretty common in plants and amphibians, but I'm going to show you has never been observed in mammals though, okay? So for plants and amphibians, you could get a scenario where you have a plant where it has, do I have an example? I have an example here, okay? These are two plants that actually are examples of what I'm going to explain. You have a plant that has a particular number of chromosomes, okay? In this case, this plant has 6. Now, you know from meiosis, when you make a sex cell, you pass on how much information? Half of it, right? So, you have 46 chromosomes. If you made an egg cell, how many would be in there? 23. Because meiosis cuts things what? In half. But sometimes what happens is a mistake, where meiosis fails to cut the number of chromosomes in half. So instead of, in this case, contributing 3, all 6 are contributed. Now, if that pollen cell is connected with an egg cell that has 3 chromosomes, that fails. You can't have an odd number of chromosomes. It has to be even. But if you have a sex cell that did not divide its chromosomes, pair up with another sex cell that did not divide its chromosomes, you have 6 and 6 is 12. You have an extra set. An extra 2 sets, actually. Now, here's the thing. If this happens, and you can see here are 2 examples. This is a plant that contains 36 chromosomes, okay? These 2 plants have 18 each. So this is actually a hybrid from these 2 plants. But what they did was they did not cut their chromosomes in half. They passed on all of their chromosomes to that plant. Now this plant has double. You can see it's got 36 versus 18. Here's another example. Now this actually is an amphibian. It's a frog. This one has 32 chromosomes, and these 2 have 16, double. When this happens, though, this, which is called a polyploid, cannot reproduce with the other ones. Now, they may be living in the same area, so they're not physically isolated, but they're genetically isolated because, well, why can't, let's think about this for a second. Why can't this plant get together with this plant? The numbers don't make sense. If you look at the math, this thing plugged in. Hold on. If you look at the math doesn't make sense. So look. Actually, you want the color. This one. Is it a plant? Can you look up for me? Is it a plant? I thought it was an amphibian. Okay. All right. It doesn't matter whether it's an amphibian or plant. It doesn't matter. It's all right. So listen up. If this plant tries to make a sex cell, it would pass on 18 chromosomes, right? If it tries together with this plant, that would be 9. The problem is 8 plus 9 is 27. You can't have an odd number because the cell, if you remember from your cell division, the chromosomes have to be separated evenly. You can't evenly separate an odd number. Yeah, it would be major problems. And that would be weeded out by natural selection. So this is a neat example of A, you get a new species immediately because you get something that's totally different than the other things, and B, an example of sympatric speciation. Yeah. So half of 32 is 16, and half of 16 is, it would be 8. That would be 24. So that would be 16, and that would be, oh no, but here's the problem. So if you do this, 16 and 8, you get 24. Now you have something that can't really reproduce with this or this. It's got now a different number of chromosomes. So it becomes even more isolated when you look at what it can reproduce with. Most likely it will die off, yeah. Sorry? So, yeah, they can reproduce with members that also have look, it's a more complicated picture than when I'm painting for you guys. It's always more complicated paints for you guys. But the idea is, the big idea is that you normally want things to have the same number of chromosomes to partner up. We'll look at an, sorry? Yeah. But eventually I'm going to talk about an interesting example with us. Again, it's more complicated than what I'm telling you, but normally we want the same number. Okay? It is more complicated. Anyway, so look. So the big idea is that you want things to become different, and the only way you can make things become more different is if you separate them some way. Okay? Something that prevents them from getting together and having babies. This picture, by the way, this is I like to look at this picture because it tells us a lot. Actually, let's talk about how fast this works, because it's actually. Oh, and you were asking about this whole. So here's an example. This is a mule from a donkey and a horse. So let me show you an example of this, because this picture here is the same as the one from up here, okay? But instead of using circles, here's an example. So here's just coloration in a lizard. This is just a hypothetical scenario, okay? So here, the idea is there's got to be some form of isolation, and then one group will evolve in one direction. I said one direction, easy girls. And another group will evolve in another direction. The two models both predict that you have to split them some way, but the difference you can see is one model says it will happen pretty quickly and then stay constant, and the other model says it happens pretty much at a constant rate, but slowly. Which model is right? I don't really care if you know which one's right. I just want to point out that the idea here is that you have to separate them some way. Okay? You got to physically or some other way. It doesn't have to be physically or behaviorally or genetically separate them some way to accumulate these differences. So we can think of this. This could be us. This could be a chimpanzee. At some point, this would have been what? What would this have been? What would this represent? Common ancestor. Okay? You can look at dogs. All the dogs around the world that that you're very familiar with would have come from some ancestral wolf. Right? And then over time, now, the isolation there would have been artificial, right? We purposely split these dogs, and we purposely tried to get characteristics out of them. Okay? It's not like a natural form of, there are examples of that, but most of what you see is probably artificial. What's really interesting, though, is you can take a human, and you could take a chimp, and we know that they can't have babies. And if they can't have babies, what are they then? What are they? They're separate species, right? But what's really interesting is if we're really good, our brain is really good at black and white. Very good at that stuff. You know when you guys do debating in high school, you're very good at, and you ever notice that you get questions and it's you have to argue this or this? But we know that often the answer is somewhere in the middle. It's never always black and white. We're really good at things that are discontinuous or things that are black or white. Like, for example, and this is how you're raised. On your birthday, when you hit 16, you can drive, right?
That was a great moment. That's all.
Yeah. However, so society says when you're 16, at the moment the clock strikes midnight, you can literally go ahead, walk into this. I know they're not open at midnight, but you can technically, you can go and apply for your license, right? As soon as the clock strikes midnight on your 16th birthday. But the second before the clock struck midnight, you couldn't. So for some reason, that one little second, something magical happened. You became competent in society's eyes, right? We're really good at black and white. And some things have to be black and white because they become really, hard to distinguish. Well, this person can drive, that person can't drive. So black and white, we know that humans and chimps are really different from each other, right? I mean, they don't look anything like each other. And we know they can't have babies, even though they tried in the past. Believe me, they have. I don't know why. But here's an interesting, I want you to think of this, okay? Because evolution is not black and white. And there are going to be examples of things that will be like, what is that? That looks really weird. I'll give you an example how this can get really weird, okay? Imagine we took a person from today, like Mary. Like, okay, Kiara. And I got into a time machine. Now, I know there's no such thing as a time machine, but imagine I got into a time machine. I took Kiara back to meet a boy from 2,000 years ago. Okay? And what I wanted to do is I wanted Kiara to get married to this boy and have babies. I'm going to ask you a simple question. Would they have babies? Yes or no? What do you think? Would a human from today be able to have a baby from someone from 2,000 years ago?
Yes, they're the same reproductive system.
Are they the same species? Yes or no? So I'm going to ask you a question. Someone from same species, right? You would think that Pontius Pilate was also a human being, just like we were, right? Okay. So what if? No, hold on. Wait. You'll see what I mean by this thought experiment. This is called, by the way, in science, a thought experiment is something you can't do in real life. But if you do it in your head, you start to understand something that you couldn't really do. So let's say we were back 2,000 years, and we took someone from 2,000 years ago, and we brought them back 2,000 years before that. So we took someone from 2,000 years ago, and we mated them from someone from 4,000 years ago. So 4,000 years ago, like that's just before Moses. So what do you think? Would they be able to have a baby?
They probably would, but messed up
So you think people from the Old Testament were different human beings than us? What do you think? What do you think? So, okay, let's continue to do that. Let's take someone from 4,000 years ago and bring him back to someone from 6,000 years ago, maybe to 10,000. 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago is when the first people arrived in North America. So those first people that came to North America, they're still people. And you would expect that you could take someone from today and get them together with someone from 10,000 years ago and have perfectly fine babies. Hold on. Huh? So here's the thing. If we kept doing that, hold on. This is where it starts to break out, right? If we kept doing that, then because right away I can see what's going on. From somebody from today, someone 2,000 years ago, yeah, no problem, sir. Someone from today, 4,000 years ago, I think so. Someone from today, 10,000 years ago, no, I don't think so. You'll see what's going on, right? As we go further back in time, you're like, no, I don't think they can have babies. But I'm not asking you, but hold on. I'm not asking today to 10,000 years ago. If you take a person from today and you made him with someone from 2,000 years ago, and then you take someone from 2,000 years ago and you made him from someone from 4,000 years ago, and then you take someone from 4,000 years ago and you made him from someone from 6,000 years ago.
Difference between those.
Right. But not from today.
I just don't think so.
Like, if you take someone from a time period and you make them with someone from a slightly earlier time period, would they have a baby? What do you think?
Yeah, well, they have this.
But you, right away, see, here's the thing. Yeah, we'll say the same. I know, because otherwise it'd take me forever to explain this. So, you would think that, you probably should be able to have, like someone from Jesus' time should be able to have babies from someone from Moses' time, right? But here's the thing. If we keep doing that experiment, and we do the exact same thought experiment on the chimpanzee side, eventually what starts to happen is the individuals start to look more and more and more like each other. And they meet somewhere in the middle. And that's disturbing for us. Because I know what I look like. I know what a chimpanzee looks like. And we get the impression that at some point, the common ancestor of a human and chimpanzee gave birth to something that was radically different. It's not the way it works. It's a slow accumulation of little differences, slight changes. And here, you might not, these two look very similar, way more similar than these two. But what happens is, as you allow more and more changes to accumulate, because they're isolated, they become more and more different. And that's what microevolution does. It's just an accumulation of these little changes. And eventually you get big change. You get big change when you allow a lot of little changes.
Is it by color? Is that what it's for?
Well, in this case, it would be color. But, for example, for humans, what would be an example of big change? Yeah, loss of hair. Brain size. What happened to our brain size? It increased, right? And that's big change. What about the face? Okay? But here's the thing. If you think about humans and chimps, as you go backwards in time, they start to look more like each other. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not like one big change. It's not like the parents of one species give rise to the offspring of a new species. It's not that quick. It's slow. Okay? On Monday, we're going to talk about a different way you can get big change. One is really simple. One is slow accumulation of little changes. I'm going to leave you with an analogy, okay? Think of microevolution as this. Imagine that Pamela is choreographing a dance at St. Joe's Memorial Park, and you guys are all involved. Okay? You guys are all involved in this dance. Pamela's specialty is, what's your specialty? Dance?
Ballet. Do ballet. Ballet.
Okay, you're a ballet dancer. So all of you guys in here are, let's say there's more of you. Let's say there's 100 of you in here, okay? There's not. Let's say that you're all trained to do ballet. So Pamela's putting on this performance, ballet performance. Now, imagine that Erica gets sick. Teacher accidentally poisons her. Okay? And, accidentally on purpose. And we need to replace yeah. Okay. No problem.
I would look around. I see lots of your photos.
I know. Imagine we have to replace Erica with Pizzuti. But Pizzuti doesn't know how to do ballet. She does hip hop. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. You got 100 people on stage and they're doing their ballet. Pizzudi's doing her hip hop. The performance, has it changed a little bit?
Yeah.
Now, has it changed a lot? Just a little bit, right? You already. Right. So, one way to get big change is if I keep doing that. If I replace Lauren with someone who can't do ballet, now I change it a little bit more. If I change Petra and replace her with someone who can't do ballet, it changes even more. Now, what do you think the people represent, though?
Yes.
What does that? Yes. Genes. As we make small changes to genes, which is what, by the way? Yeah, I know. What is small change to genes? Okay. Eventually you get macro. But how can you make a change in one gene that makes a dramatic change? Well, in the example that I gave you, I get rid of Pamela. And I replace her with Angeli. And Angeli hates ballet. If you think about, you have the performers and you have the choreographer. A lot of genes in your bodies are like performers. They have very specific tasks. But you'll see on Monday, there are genes that are like choreographers. And they control the performers. And if you can change those genes in a very simple way, you can make a huge change. And that's the second way you can make a big change. It's got a really interesting name. And we'll talk about this.
Today.
It's called Evo Devo,
Yeah, I got that.
which means evolutionary development. Okay, so we'll leave off with that.